When a person crosses a border for a vacation, a beach weekend, or a visit with family, they expect to be left alone. A tourist is not supposed to be anyone's enemy. A road trip is not supposed to be a death sentence. That is the entire promise of an ordinary life. But in the parts of Mexico where the cartels run the highways, the men with the guns have a different idea of what a stranger on their road is for. They see an out-of-state plate, an unfamiliar truck, a vehicle that does not slow down fast enough, and they see a target. By the time anyone learns what the victims were mistaken for, the victims are already gone. A son dying in his mother's arms at a checkpoint. A Marine shot through the heart a mile short of the beach. A scientist hunting a wildflower in the wrong mountains. 2 grandmothers killed for the truck they were driving home. These are the Americans who drove south and never came home. Section 1. Jesus Macias. Jesus Macias was 62 years old, a father of 5, a Rockford man who had spent his life doing the ordinary, honorable work that holds a family together. The people who knew him described him in the plainest and highest terms a person can be described, as a hard-working man who got up and did his 9 to 5 the way working people everywhere do, who provided for his children, who hurt no one. He was, by every account, exactly the kind of man the holiday drive was made for. He still had his mother living in Mexico, in the north-central state of Zacatecas, and like so many sons before him, he made the long trip down to be with her for the season. He was going home to see his mother for Christmas. There is hardly a more universal reason to travel anywhere. The place he was driving into, though, had become one of the most dangerous states in all of Mexico. Zacatecas sits in the high, dry center of the country, a land of silver mining history and wide ranching valleys, and for most of its past, it had been a quiet place, far from the worst of the violence that gripped other regions. That changed in the years before Jesus made his last drive. Zacatecas had the misfortune of sitting at a crossroads, a key transit corridor for drugs moving north toward the United States, including the synthetic opioids that had become the cartel's most profitable cargo. 2 enormous criminal organizations, the Sinaloa cartel and its rival from Jalisco, went to war over that ground, and the state came apart. By the time of Jesus' trip, Zacatecas carried one of the highest homicide rates in the country. Bodies turned up on its highways and in its plazas. And the cartels had taken to controlling movement through their territory the way an occupying army would, by setting up their own checkpoints on the roads, improvised roadblocks manned by armed men who decided for themselves who could pass and who could not. Those illegal checkpoints were the specific danger that the holiday drive ran into year after year. A family in a loaded vehicle, often with out-of-state or foreign plates, often carrying gifts and cash, and the visible signs of a life built in the north, made exactly the kind of target the gunmen watched for. The Mexican government understood the danger well enough that, in the years before, it had begun organizing official measures to try to protect the holiday travelers. Authorities ran campaigns to improve safety on the roads, going so far as to organize mass caravans, escorting long convoys of returning families from the border all the way to their home states so that they could travel in protected numbers rather than alone. The travelers, as one advocate later described it, had been promised security all the way to their pueblos, all the way to the places they came from. The very existence of those caravans was an admission of how dangerous the ordinary act of going home had become. Jesus Macias made his trip at the end of December 2024. He reached his mother's home in Zacatecas, and he did the small, tender things a son does when he comes home for the holidays. At one point during the visit, he and his family went out and picked up a stove, a gift for his mother, the grandmother of the family, the kind of practical, loving present that says a person is thinking about the comfort of the people they love. It was an errand, nothing more, the sort of small task that fills the days of a holiday visit. He was a son, buying his mother a stove for Christmas. On December 30th, 2024, with that errand among the things he was doing, Jesus was on the road in Zacatecas with his family, when he came upon one of the cartel's checkpoints. Armed men had set up a stop along the highway, the kind of unauthorized roadblock that had become a feature of the roads in that part of the state. What exactly the gunmen wanted, whether the vehicle, whether to rob the travelers, whether simply to assert their control over who moved through their ground, was never made plain in any way that could comfort the people he left behind. What is known is what the gunmen did. To force the vehicle to stop, they fired on it. According to his family, they shot up the tires so that he could not drive on, and then, with the vehicle halted, they shot him. The detail that his family carried afterward, the one that turns a statistic into a wound, is where he died. His niece, Giselle Jimenez, described it in the simplest words. They had just picked up the stove as a gift for her grandmother, she said. The gunmen shot the tires so he would stop, and then they shot him, and he died in her grandmother's arms. A son who had driven 1,000 miles to spend Christmas with his mother died in his mother's arms on a Zacatecas road, killed at a checkpoint set up by men who had no authority to stop anyone, for reasons that would never fully be explained. He was 62 years old. The killing of Jesus Macias did not happen in isolation, and that was part of what made it land so hard among the families who travel south. It came during a stretch of days in which the holiday roads of Mexico turned especially deadly for Americans visiting their relatives. Only 3 days before Jesus was shot, 2 brothers from the Chicago area had been killed in a shooting on a highway in the neighboring state of Durango, an attack that also gravely wounded a 14-year-old boy who was traveling with them, a child who survived but was left fighting for his life. 2 separate American families, 2 separate states, both struck down within the same week, both engaged in nothing more than the seasonal pilgrimage home. For the communities back in Illinois, the pattern was impossible to ignore. The drive that had been a fixture of family life for decades was becoming, in those years, a journey that some people did not come back from. For the Macias family, the grief was bound up with a particular kind of disbelief. The disbelief that comes when violence finds someone who lived an entirely ordinary and blameless life. He was not involved in anything. He was not connected to the drug trade in any way. He was a man who, as a relative put it, did his 9 to 5 just like every American citizen does, and it was not fair that this was happening to him, and something needed to be done about it. There was no satisfying answer to that demand, no clean resolution that could be offered to a family that had simply sent a son home to his mother and gotten back a body. The work of the days that followed was the brutal logistical work that these deaths always require, the work of bringing him home. His body was returned to Rockford, across the same 1,000 miles he had driven south only days before, and he was laid to rest in the city where he had built his life. The case fit into a grim and widening picture that American officials and Mexican families alike had come to recognize. The United States government had warned its citizens for years to exercise increased caution in Zacatecas because of crime, naming it among the states where violent crime and gang activity were common, where the roads themselves had become hazardous. Those warnings, like all the travel advisories that hovered over so many of these stories, existed and were documented and were difficult to weigh against the pull of family. A man with an elderly mother in Zacatecas was not going to stay home in Illinois for Christmas because of a paragraph on a government website. He was going to go see his mother, the way he always had, the way his parents and grandparents had crossed back and forth across that border their whole lives. The danger was abstract, until the moment it was not. What made the deaths of holiday travelers so difficult to prevent was precisely that the victims were doing the most natural thing in the world. They were not adventurers, seeking out remote and risky places. They were not crossing into cartel country out of recklessness. They were going home, and the cartels that controlled the roads had made the simple act of driving through their territory into a gamble with stakes that the travelers themselves often did not fully understand. A checkpoint could appear on a familiar highway that had been safe a year before. A vehicle full of gifts could be read as a target, a refusal to stop, or a failure to stop quickly enough, or simply the bad luck of being on the wrong road at the wrong hour, could turn a Christmas visit into a funeral. The advocates who worked with these families spoke of the official caravans, of the promises of protection all the way to the home villages. But the caravans could not reach every family on every road, and the promises could not cover the thousands of separate small journeys that made up the great winter migration south. There is something almost unbearably gentle about the particular shape of Jesus Macias's death that sets it apart even among these stories. He was not killed fleeing or fighting, or caught in a crossfire between rival gangs. He was killed on an errand of love, having just bought his mother a stove, a gift to keep her warm. He was killed in front of his family, and he died held by his own mother, the woman he had crossed a continent to see. The image is the kind that stays with people, the elderly mother cradling her grown son on a roadside, a Christmas visit ending in the worst way a parent can imagine, the natural order of things violently inverted so that a mother held her dying child instead of the other way around. His family, like so many of the families in these accounts, was left to carry both the grief and the impossible questions. No arrest could give them back the man who died in his mother's arms. No explanation could make sense of gunmen shooting a 62-year-old father of 5 at a roadblock on his way through his own family's home state. What they were left with was the memory of a hard-working, decent man, a son and a father, who had done everything right and had still been taken, and the determination, voiced by his relatives in the days after, that his death should mean something, that something had to change so that other families driving home for Christmas would not meet the same fate. It was the same plea that echoes through every one of these stories, the plea of ordinary people who never imagined that their own quiet lives could intersect with such violence, asking that the next family be spared. Jesus Macias had driven south the way he always had, toward the warmth of his mother's home at the end of a long year, carrying gifts, looking forward to the holidays. He came up against a checkpoint that should not have existed, manned by men who answered to no one. And he died on a road in Zacatecas with a Christmas present for his mother, still fresh in the vehicle. He was a Rockford man, an American citizen, a father, a son. The drive home had been the safest and most ordinary thing in his world, and it was the thing that killed him. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case moves to the desert highways of Sonora, an hour south of the Arizona border, where a young Marine veteran from Tucson set out for the beach he had loved since he was a boy. He never stopped for the armed men who tried to wave his truck down on a dark stretch of road, and a familiar weekend trip ended in a hail of gunfire short of the coast. Section 2. Nicholas Quetsz. Nicholas Douglas Quetsz, who everyone knew as Nick, was 31 years old, a man from Tucson who had treated the Mexican beach town of Rocky Point as his nearest ocean since boyhood, an hour south of the Arizona border. He came from a family for whom service to the country was almost a birthright. He had been born in Panama, where his father was stationed in the military at the time, and he had wanted to serve his whole life. His family counted more than 100 years of combined service to the nation across the generations, in active duty, in the reserves, and in federal work. A lineage of soldiers and public servants stretching back 6 generations. His father was a 20-year Army veteran. Nick had followed that path in his own way. After high school, he spent 4 years in the United States Marine Corps, deploying to places around the world, including Australia and parts of Southeast Asia. When he came home, he kept building a life of the same quiet, useful kind. He earned several degrees from a community college in Tucson and became a certified welder. He had recently started a new job working for the county on water reclamation projects, the unglamorous, essential work of keeping a city running. The people who knew him described a particular kind of man. His father called him the life of the party, someone who threw caution to the wind, but never hurt anyone who was not a bad person. The thing his family came back to again and again was that he was a protector by nature. His father said the unique thing about Nick was that he would not even hurt a flea if it would cause harm to someone else, and that because of that quality, he had an enormous circle of friends, the kind of person whose new coworkers, after only a month on the job, reached out to the family when he died, because he had already left a mark on them. He was an outdoorsman, a diver, an adventurer. He had been to Rocky Point and other places in Sonora countless times. He felt comfortable in Mexico. It was familiar ground, a place he had enjoyed his whole life. On Friday, October 18, 2024, Nick got off work in Tucson around 2 in the afternoon, went home, and then drove southeast to the border town of Nogales. There, he picked up his girlfriend and her mother, who were coming along for the trip, a weekend of ocean adventure at the beach he had visited so many times. He had last spoken with his father the evening before. From Nogales, instead of taking the recommended route to Rocky Point through the Lukeville crossing, the group crossed into Mexico at Nogales and headed overland across the interior of Sonora toward the resort, driving Nick's pickup truck, a Ford F-250 that was nearly 30 years old. The route took them through the dangerous triangle of desert, along the highways near Altar and Caborca, exactly the country that the United States warned its own people to stay out of. Nick's father later said he wished the family had been aware of how much turmoil had taken hold of the region. Nick had known the place for years, as somewhere safe and welcoming. He did not seem to understand how badly it had changed. It was just before 8 o'clock in the evening, after dark, when they reached the worst possible point. According to the account pieced together by Sonora state prosecutors, Nick's truck was first attacked while driving on a state highway east of where it meets the main federal road near Altar. The trigger, by the most widely reported account, was a checkpoint. An armed group had set up an unauthorized stop on the road, the kind of improvised roadblock the cartels use to control movement through their territory. Nick did not stop. His family believes they know why. His father, reflecting on it later, said he thought the whole thing was about the truck, that the gunmen had tried to stop Nick and he had tried to drive through, and that any military member would tell you that driving through is exactly what you do when you are ambushed. A Marine's instinct, trained into him, was not to halt for armed men on a dark road, but to push past them and get away. The gunmen opened fire. Nick fled from that first burst of shooting, and his truck made it from the state highway onto the federal highway, just west of Altar. But the criminal group pursued him. They caught up to him on the Altar to Caborca highway, and there, in front of a tire store, a vehicle pulled alongside his truck, and the men inside opened fire in what prosecutors called a direct attack. Nick's 2 passengers, his girlfriend and her mother, managed to survive by crouching down, dropping below the line of fire, and they were not hit. Nick was. He was struck and fatally wounded. By the account later honored by United States officials, he was shot in the back, the bullet passing through his heart. Paramedics reached the scene and tried to provide medical care, but it was too late. Nick Quetsz was already dead. He was 31 years old, a Marine who had deployed around the world and come home safely, killed on a desert highway an hour from the Arizona border while driving to the beach. His girlfriend and her mother, who survived, were unharmed physically, but they had watched it happen from inside the truck. The family, back in Tucson, received the kind of phone call that ends a normal life. Nick's father said the absence left a void the family would have a hard time getting past, describing the small, ordinary habit of putting off a task and telling himself he would just wait until Nick got there to help, and the hollow understanding that Nick was never going to be there to help again. In the days that followed, the killing became national news in the United States, in part because of its timing. It happened in the final weeks before a presidential election, and Nick's death was raised at campaign rallies in Arizona, held up as an example of cartel violence spilling across the border. His family had complicated feelings about that. They said repeatedly that they did not want his death politicized, that they were apolitical people who had simply given their lives to the service of the country. His father described himself as someone who had always put his heart and body on the line for the United States, not for any party. What the family wanted was not a talking point. It was answers, and accountability, and the return of their son. Getting those things proved painful in its own way. In the first days after the murder, the family said they had heard almost nothing from their own government beyond the consulate's initial notification that Nick was dead. His brother-in-law, a retired Air Force captain, expressed the family's shock that days had passed with no real communication after a military veteran transiting Mexico had been executed on the highway. The family pointed to their own long record of service and said, simply, that they needed their country to have their back. They called for the United States to take a direct role in the investigation, for the FBI to be involved, and for any suspects to be extradited to the United States and prosecuted there, because they found it hard to take the Mexican process entirely at face value. Nick's father said he would not stop until the case was prosecuted through the American justice system. The Mexican government did take over the local investigation, and Sonora authorities moved quickly, at least on paper. Within days of the killing, state and federal forces launched a major search operation across the Alta Caborca Desert, hunting for the men responsible. That search itself turned into more violence. Security forces on a dirt road came under fire from a sand-colored pickup truck, whose occupants began shooting when they noticed the patrol. With the help of a Black Hawk helicopter providing air support, the authorities located the attackers, and in the firefight that followed, several gunmen were killed and a cache of assault rifles, tactical vests, and ammunition was seized. Over the following weeks, arrests were announced. Authorities said they had detained multiple suspects in connection with Nick's killing. One was described as a member of a cell that worked for the Chapitos, the faction of the Sinaloa cartel made up of the sons of the imprisoned kingpin known as El Chapo. One suspect was reported to be a Honduran national. In early November, Sonora officials announced that a man had been formally indicted on a charge of qualified homicide in Nick's death, along with attempted homicide against his 2 passengers and criminal association. For the family, the arrests did not settle the deepest questions, and they remained wary of whether the men being paraded before cameras were truly the ones responsible. The larger truth of the case fit a pattern that American officials had been warning about for years. The highways of Sonora, like those of Tamaulipas and so many other states, had become places where the cartels controlled movement, where a stranger in a pickup truck, who did not stop at an improvised checkpoint, could be chased down and killed, and where the line between an ordinary weekend trip and a death sentence came down to which road a person chose and what hour they were on it. The State Department's standing advice that travelers should reconsider going to Sonora at all because of crime and kidnapping and should reach Rocky Point only by the single recommended highway had been on the books before Nick ever set out. The warnings existed. The danger was documented. But for a young man who had known Rocky Point his whole life as a friendly, familiar place, the abstract language of a travel advisory could not compete with years of happy memories of the same beach. His mother put into words the thing that families in these cases so often reach for, the desire to wring some meaning out of a death that had none. She said they could not change the horrific murder of her son, but they could try to ensure that another mother did not suffer the same tragedy, that they had the power to make a change. The family set up a memorial scholarship in Nick's name for local students pursuing welding and the trades, the work he had chosen for himself, and they fought to bring his remains home to Arizona. He was remembered by the people who loved him as a beloved son and brother and uncle, a protector, the life of the party, a sixth-generation servant of a country he had been proud to wear the uniform of. The hardest part, for anyone looking at the case from the outside, was how close it all was. Nick Quetsz was not killed in some remote jungle or distant mountain town. He died an hour's drive from the United States, on a route Arizonans had treated as routine for generations, heading to a beach that thousands of American families still visit every year. He had served his country around the world and come home. He had a new job and a wide circle of friends and a whole life in front of him. And he was shot through the heart on a dark Sonora highway because he would not stop his truck for armed men at a checkpoint they had no right to set up, on a road his own government had begged Americans never to drive. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case stays in the same violent stretch of Sonora, but turns from a weekend at the beach to a young scientist on the most important research trip of his life. A graduate student from California crossed the border to search the mountains for a single rare plant, and somewhere on those back roads he met the men who ruled them. Section 3. Gabriel Trujillo. Gabriel Trujillo was 31 years old, a doctoral student at the University of California, Berkeley, one of the finest universities in the world. He was a botanist, a field biologist, a man whose passion was the study of plants and the forces that shaped how they lived and spread across the earth. He had attended a boarding school in New Mexico, earned his undergraduate degree at a college in Illinois, and won a prestigious fellowship that supported his graduate work. He was in his 4th year of his PhD in Berkeley's Department of Integrative Biology, on track to finish in 2025. His colleagues and teachers described him in the warmest terms, as a passionate ecologist, a field biologist of real talent, and an advocate for bringing more diverse voices into science. The people who loved him called him brilliant and genuine and adventurous, brave and generous, and above all, unfailingly kind and loving to everyone he met. His department, after his death, wrote that the world was a less bright place for the loss of him. His research had a specific and almost poetic focus. For 4 years he had been tracking a single flowering shrub, the common buttonbush, a plant that grows in wetlands across a remarkable range of climates, from the cold reaches of Canada down through the United States and into Mexico. Gabriel wanted to understand why one species could thrive in such wildly different places, how a plant native to swamps and floodplains could adapt across boreal and tropical zones alike, and what the answer might mean for protecting and restoring habitats in a changing world. His interest, as he described it in his own words on his research group's website, was in the forces that drive evolution in plants, in the rare ways that tropical species expand their ranges into temperate zones. It was the kind of deep, patient, unglamorous science that does not make headlines, the work of a man who could be put in a room full of children and would immediately lead them all outside to go hunting for bugs and plants and frogs. He often took a young niece to a pond in Michigan to look for frogs together. After he died, she named a stuffed frog in his honor. The trip to Sonora in June of 2023 was meant to be a culmination, both professionally and personally. Gabriel was searching for the buttonbush in the mountains of the state, hoping to choose a site where he could apply his research to a real project, building a garden in Mexico and using the plant for wetland restoration. The trip had a deeper meaning for him as well. He was drawn to Sonora because it was the ancestral land of the Opata, the indigenous people he traced his own roots to, and he hoped to connect with that heritage through the dry, mountainous country his ancestors had lived in. He was engaged to be married to a woman named Roxanne, who shared both his scientific calling and indigenous ancestry of her own. The couple had pledged to merge their identities and their work, to build a life and a family together. They had bought a house. They had commissioned custom engagement rings. They were planning a wedding led by an indigenous elder for later that year, and they had spent 2 years in fertility treatments because they wanted children. This summer trip to Sonora was supposed to be Gabriel's last solo research journey before the couple began trying to have a baby. It was meant to be the threshold between one chapter of his life and the next. His family begged him not to go. They knew Sonora's reputation. The state had recorded hundreds of homicides in the first months of that year alone, and the violence in its interior had grown worse as factions of the Sinaloa cartel and a rival group warred over the smuggling corridors. To the people who loved him, the danger was obvious, and the trip was not worth it. But Gabriel believed the research mattered, that this was crucial work, the kind of field work that could not be done from a desk or a library. He had made the crossing before. He understood the risks in the abstract way that a careful person understands them, and he weighed them against the importance of the work and decided to go. He crossed into Mexico from Arizona through Nogales on June 17, 2023. The next day, June 18th, he spoke with his fiancée and with his father. It was the last anyone heard from him. When the communication stopped, the alarm spread quickly, first among the people who loved him, and then among the scientific community that knew his work. His fiancée reported him missing after she did not hear from him on the morning of June 18th. Other biologists, in both Sonora and California, began trying to find him, reaching out through their networks, asking after a young American researcher who had gone into the mountains looking for a plant. What happened to those who searched is its own grim measure of the place. Biologists from both sides of the border received threats simply for looking for Gabriel Trujillo, warned off by people who did not want them asking questions in that country. The act of trying to find a missing scientist was itself dangerous enough to draw menace from the men who controlled the ground. On June 22, 2023, 4 days after he was last heard from, the search ended in the worst way. Gabriel's body was found on the side of a road in the municipality of Yecora, in the mountains of Sonora, along a stretch connecting two small communities. He had been shot. His father told reporters that his son had been shot 7 times. His body was discovered in an SUV. Investigators determined he had been killed 3 days before he was found, on June 19th, the same day his family had reported him missing, which meant he had died almost immediately after his last contact with the people he loved. The university confirmed his death to its community on June 23rd. A young man who had crossed a border to look for a flowering shrub, who had a wedding planned, and a house bought, and a future carefully laid out, had been gunned down on a remote mountain road and left in a vehicle by the side of it. The motive was never cleanly established, and that uncertainty is part of what makes the case so haunting. There was no clear reason for anyone to want Gabriel Trujillo dead. He was not involved in the drug trade, not connected to any criminal group, not carrying anything of value to the cartels, not a threat to anyone. The most plausible explanation, offered by those who study violence in that region, was the one that recurs through so many of these stories. He had driven into a war zone at the worst possible time, into a part of Sonora where multiple cartels were fighting over the same territory, where gunmen patrolled the roads looking for rivals and treated any unknown vehicle, any stranger who did not belong, as a potential enemy. A private investigator who specialized in crime in Mexico described the situation as a hornet's nest, a region where the fragmentation of the Sinaloa cartel had left several armed groups patrolling the same space, hunting each other's men and willing to kill anyone who could not account for themselves. A lone American driving the back roads of that country, however innocent his purpose, was exactly the kind of person who could be stalked by cartel lookouts, mistaken for something he was not, and killed before he could explain. The killing of Gabriel Trujillo became part of a larger and disturbing pattern, the growing danger faced by scientists and researchers working in parts of Mexico controlled by organized crime. His was not the first such case. Years earlier, biologists studying wildcats in the northeastern state of Tamaulipas had been forced to abandon their fieldwork entirely after shootings and the theft of their research equipment by people tied to the cartels. An entire region's worth of conservation work, the study of jaguars and ocelots and black bears, had simply come to an end because the insecurity made it impossible to continue. Gabriel's death was a stark addition to that grim trend, a reminder that the cartel's control of the land had consequences far beyond the drug trade itself, that it closed off whole landscapes to the patient, peaceful work of understanding the natural world. Scientists and conservationists called on the Mexican government to fully investigate his death and deliver justice for him and his family. For the people who loved Gabriel, the loss was immeasurable, and the timing unbearably cruel. He had been on the verge of everything, about to finish his doctorate, about to be married, about to start a family with the woman he had built so many plans with. His mother had died of cancer a decade before, and his death left his father, his fiancée, 5 siblings, 6 nieces, and a nephew to grieve a man who had been, by every account, the kind of person who made the world brighter for the people around him. His obituary spoke of his passion for nature and culture, and his relentless drive for science. The custom engagement rings, the bought house, the wedding planned with an indigenous elder, the fertility treatments undertaken so the couple could have children, all of it became the architecture of a future that would never be built. A funeral was held for him across 2 states, in Michigan and California, gathering the far-flung pieces of a life that had touched many places. There is a particular sorrow in the shape of Gabriel Trujillo's death that sets it apart. He did not go to Mexico for a vacation or a party or a thrill. He went for knowledge and for heritage, drawn to the ancestral land of his own people and to a scientific question he had devoted years of his life to answering. He went looking for a plant that grows in wetlands, a humble shrub that might one day help restore damaged habitats, and he went hoping to touch the roots of his own identity in the mountains his ancestors had walked. He was as far from a combatant in anyone's war as a person could be. And the war found him anyway, on a back road in the Sonora mountains, and took everything, the research and the wedding and the children, and the bright future his teachers and family had seen coming. He was shot 7 times and left in an SUV, in a place he had gone only to study the living world, by men who likely never knew or cared who he was or why he had come. His fiancée, his father, his colleagues, and the wider community of scientists who mourned him were left with the same impossible questions that follow every one of these deaths, and with a particular warning that his case carried. The danger in Mexico had grown so vast and so indiscriminate that it now reached even the gentlest of pursuits, that a young man could be killed simply for driving the wrong road in search of a wildflower. The travel warnings that hung over Sonora, urging Americans to reconsider any trip there because of crime and kidnapping, had been on the books, and his family had pleaded with him to heed them. But Gabriel had believed in the work, and the work had taken him into the mountains, and the mountains belonged to men who killed first and asked nothing at all. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case moves north to the state of Durango, where a father and his teenage son drove down from Chicago to celebrate the boy's 14th birthday with family. On a roadside at night, gunmen opened fire on their vehicle, and a birthday trip ended with 2 brothers dead and a child fighting for his life. Section 4. Vicente Peña Jr. and Antonio Fernandez. The 2 men who would not come back were brothers in spirit and in family. Vicente Peña Jr. was 38 years old, a Chicago man from the Logan Square neighborhood. Antonio Fernandez, who everyone called Tony, was 44, also from Chicago, the boy's uncle. The 3rd American in the group was the reason for the timing of the trip, Vicente's 14-year-old son, whose birthday they were traveling to celebrate. All 3 were United States citizens. They had set out for the north-central Mexican state of Durango to visit family and to mark the boy's birthday, the kind of trip that combines obligation and joy, the gathering of relatives across a border for an occasion worth gathering for. A fundraiser later created by the boy's mother described the trip in the simplest terms, saying that the teenager had traveled to Durango with his father, his brother, and his uncle to visit family and celebrate turning 14. It was meant to be a birthday, surrounded by the people who loved him. Durango sits in the rugged interior of Mexico, a state of mountains and high plains, part of the region long known as the Golden Triangle, the area shared by Durango, Sinaloa, and Chihuahua that has for decades been the heartland of Mexican drug production. It is country of dramatic geography and, increasingly, of danger. Terrain so complex and so dominated by the cartels that the authorities themselves often cannot reach into the worst of it. By the end of 2024, the violence in Durango had been worsening, fed by the upheaval in the neighboring state of Sinaloa. The Sinaloa cartel, one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the world, had been thrown into a vicious internal war after the dramatic capture of its longtime leaders, including the co-founder known as El Mayo and one of the sons of the imprisoned kingpin El Chapo. both taken into United States custody in the summer of that year. With the old leadership removed, the cartel's factions turned on one another, and the fighting spilled outward from Sinaloa into the bordering states. Durango, sharing both a border and a long history with that world, felt the shockwaves. A transition of power was unfolding among the cartels, a violent reshuffling that experts warned could last for months or even years. And one of the things that made such transitions so deadly was the struggle for control of the roads, because controlling the roads was vital to controlling the territory. It was onto one of those roads that the Chicago family drove. On the night of Friday, December 27, 2024, the group was traveling in an SUV, a black GMC Yukon with Illinois license plates, along the Francisco Zarco Highway, in the area of Santiago Papasquiaro, a municipality in Durango. With them in the vehicle were the two American brothers, the 14-year-old boy, and a fourth person, a 22-year-old relative named Jorge Eduardo Vargas Aguirre, who was a local Durango resident. They were, by every account, simply a family in a car, visiting relatives over the holidays. The boy, 2 days from his birthday. There is no public information to suggest they were anything other than that. No connection to the drug trade. No reason for anyone to want them dead. They were traveling the roads of a state in the grip of a cartel war, in a vehicle with out-of-state plates, at night, and that, as far as anyone has been able to determine, was enough. What happened on that highway was sudden and total. Gunmen opened fire on the SUV. The vehicle was found Friday night by the side of the road, the family inside and beside it, all of them having been shot. The wounds, according to local police, were gunshot wounds to the head. Vicente Peña Jr. was killed. His brother Tony Fernandez was killed. The young Durango relative, Jorge Eduardo Vargas Aguirre, was killed. 3 of the 4 were dead. Only the boy survived, the 14-year-old whose birthday the trip had been meant to celebrate. He had been shot in the head and was gravely wounded, clinging to life on a roadside in Durango, the lone survivor of an attack that had wiped out the men who had brought him there. The circumstances of the shooting were never fully clarified, and that absence of explanation is its own kind of cruelty. Authorities investigated whether robbery had been the motive. Officials described the attack against the backdrop of a surge in violent crime in the area, the spillover from the cartel war next door. But there was no public indication that the family had been targeted for any reason connected to themselves. No sign the murders were tied to the family's own conduct in any way. The most likely reading, the one that fit the place and the moment, was the grimly familiar one. A vehicle full of strangers, with Illinois plates, moving at night through contested country during a violent power struggle, had been treated as a threat or an opportunity by armed men who controlled the road, and had been fired upon without warning and without mercy. The same logic that had killed travelers on the highways of Sonora and Tamaulipas and Zacatecas had killed this family on a highway in Durango. The news reached Chicago in the worst way a family can receive it. The boy's grandmother, Maria Elena Hernandez, was still in Chicago when she got a desperate phone call from her daughter in Mexico. The daughter's words, as the grandmother later recounted them through a translator, were the raw sound of a mother's worst moment. She said they had killed her boy, that they had killed Junior, that they had killed her brother-in-law, and that she did not know what to do. In a single night, a woman had lost her husband and her brother-in-law and very nearly her son, and the family back in Illinois was left scrambling to understand what had happened and to do the only thing they could, which was to try to bring the survivors home. The boy's younger brother, back in Chicago, had to be told that his father and his uncle were dead and that his older brother was in a coma in a Mexican hospital. A local activist who stepped in to help the family described it as a nightmare, a family living through something no family should have to endure, and said the most urgent goal was simply to get them home so they could be safe. The struggle to bring the wounded boy home laid bare another layer of the tragedy, the practical helplessness that families face when violence strikes them across a border. The teenager was in critical condition, in a coma, in a hospital in Mexico, and getting him the care he needed and eventually back to the United States was, in the words of the activist working with the family, nightmarish. She described the difficulty of navigating Mexican hospitals with their own protocols and procedures, the frustration of being a United States citizen in a foreign country's medical system that did not bend for that fact, the sheer challenge of coordinating an international medical evacuation for a child who had been shot in the head. Eventually, the boy was airlifted to the United States for extended treatment, removed from the country where his father and uncle had been killed, brought home to continue a long and uncertain recovery. He had survived, but he carried wounds that would mark the rest of his life, and he had lost, in a single night, the father who had brought him on the trip, and the uncle who had come along to celebrate his birthday. In this case, unlike so many others in this account, there was a measure of accountability, and it came relatively swiftly. The Durango authorities pursued the case, and within days they had a suspect. On January 6, 2025, the Durango Attorney General's office announced that a man named Iram Uranga Armendariz had been charged in the attack. He was prosecuted, and he was sentenced to a prison term of 66 years, 7 months, and 9 days, a sentence that reflected the gravity of what had been done, the killing of 3 people and the maiming of a child. For a great many of the families in these stories, no one is ever caught, and no one ever answers for the deaths of their loved ones. The Peña Fernandez family at least received that much: a conviction and a long sentence, a formal acknowledgement by the state that a crime had been committed and a name attached to it. Whether it brought them any peace is a different question, and not one that a prison sentence can answer. A conviction does not return a father to his sons, or a brother to his family, or undo the damage done to a boy who turned 14 in the worst week of his life. The killing of the 2 Chicago brothers, coming as it did within the same stretch of days as the killing of Jesus Macias in Zacatecas, drove home a pattern that the families who make the holiday drive had come to dread. 2 American families, both from Illinois, both visiting relatives in Mexico over the holidays, both struck down by cartel-linked violence on the roads within days of each other at the very end of 2024. The shootings reignited the warnings and the fears that surround the great winter migration south. The United States government had urged travelers to exercise increased caution in Durango because of crime, noting that violent crime and gang activity were common in parts of the state. Experts encouraged Americans with family in such regions to postpone travel altogether or to take extreme security measures if a visit could not be avoided. But the advice, sound as it was, ran headlong into the deepest currents of family and tradition. People with parents and siblings and home villages in Mexico were not going to abandon the holidays because of a travel advisory. They were going to make the drive, the way they always had, because the family was there, and it was Christmas, and a boy was turning 14. What lingers about the Durango case is the birthday at the center of it, the simple, joyful reason the family had made the trip at all. They had not gone seeking anything dangerous. They had gone to celebrate a child turning 14, to gather the family around him, to mark a milestone the way families do. The boy's father had brought him, his uncle had come along, and they had driven into a state torn apart by a cartel war they had nothing to do with, on a night when the wrong armed men were watching the road. 2 days before the boy's birthday, his father and his uncle were dead on a roadside, and the boy himself was shot in the head and left fighting for his life. He survived to mark the birthday, and every birthday after it, carrying the knowledge of what that trip had cost. Vicente Peña Jr. and Tony Fernandez had driven south to give a boy a birthday surrounded by family, and they gave their lives on a Durango highway for the offense of being strangers on a road the cartels had claimed. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case travels to the far other end of the country, to the surf breaks of Baja California, below the city of Ensenada. 3 young men, 2 Australian brothers, and their American friend, pitched their tents on a cliff above the Pacific for a weekend of surfing. They were approached in the night by people who wanted nothing more than their truck, and the small, ordinary thing that want led to ended at the bottom of a well. Section 5. Jack Carter Road. In late April of 2024, 3 young men set out from the San Diego area for a weekend of surfing and camping in Baja California, on the rugged Pacific coast below the city of Ensenada. 2 of them were brothers from Australia. Callum Robinson was 33 and lived in the Ocean Beach neighborhood of San Diego, where he had built a life. He was a former professional lacrosse player, a big, warm, larger-than-life man whose teammates and family had nicknamed him the Big Koala. His mother would later describe him as a lovable, larger-than-life character. His younger brother, Jake Robinson, was 30 and a doctor, visiting from Australia and staying with Callum. The United States had become, in his mother's words, a second home for her sons, and the Ocean Beach community had embraced them. The third member of the group was the American, Jack Carter Road, who went by Carter. He was 30 years old, a resident of the Point Loma neighborhood of San Diego, and a 2014 graduate of Point Loma Nazarene University. He was newly engaged. The weekend trip was, among other things, a small celebration of his engagement and his upcoming wedding, which was planned for that summer. He was a young man at the start of the best part of his life, about to be married, taking a surf trip with 2 close friends along a coast he loved. The 3 of them packed up a white Chevrolet Colorado pickup truck, loaded it with surfing gear and camping equipment, and drove south across the border into Baja. They were chronicling the trip the way young people do, posting photographs to social media of the waves and the isolated beaches, the kind of images that make a place look like paradise. They surfed near a well-known spot, and they made their way to a remote, sparsely populated stretch of coast called Punta San Jose, roughly 20 miles south of Ensenada, where they set up camp on the bluffs above the ocean. It was exactly the sort of place they had come for, empty and quiet, far from any town. They planned to spend the weekend camping there, and then check into a rented Airbnb in the resort town of Rosarito before heading home. There was nothing reckless about it, by the standards of the surfing world. People did this all the time. The first contact with the people who would kill them came on the night of April 27th. A young woman named Ari Giselle Silva Raya, 23 years old, came to the area of Punta San Jose that night and encountered the 3 campers. She saw what they had with them. She noticed the truck, the surfing equipment, the phones, the things that to her looked like wealth worth taking. Later that same night, she contacted a man she was involved with, her romantic partner, and told him about the 3 foreigners camping out in the remote spot. According to the evidence later presented by Mexican prosecutors, she described the truck in detail and told her accomplices, in plain words, that the campers had good phones and good tires. That was the sum of it. Good phones and good tires. That was the reason 3 young men were marked to die. Sometime in the dark hours between roughly 10 o'clock that night and 2 in the morning, 3 men went back to the campsite at Punta San Jose. What they wanted was the truck and the belongings, a robbery, nothing more in their original design. But the surfers were there, and the encounter turned deadly. Prosecutors said the attackers intentionally surprised the 3 campers and shot them with firearms. Each of the 3 young men was killed by a gunshot to the head. Whether they tried to fight back to protect their truck or simply had no chance at all, the result was the same. Callum, Jake, and Carter were dead on the bluff above the ocean, where they had pitched their tents. The killers then tried to erase what they had done. They took the truck and the belongings. They moved the bodies away from the campsite to hide them. The men's tents and some of their possessions were burned in an effort to destroy evidence. The pickup truck was later found at a different location to the north, at a private ranch, and it too had been set on fire in an attempt to wipe away any trace. The killers were not professionals carrying out some calculated cartel hit. They were thieves who had murdered 3 men over their possessions and then panicked, trying to make the whole thing disappear. For a few days, the families simply knew that the 3 men were missing. The surfers had been due to check into their Airbnb in Rosarito after the camping weekend and had not shown up. Callum had failed to appear for work back in San Diego. On April 28th, they were reported missing. The mother of the two Australian brothers, Deborah Robinson, posted a frantic message on a Baja Facebook group used by travelers and locals, saying her sons had not been heard from since April 27th and pleading for any information. The disappearance set off an intense search, with attention pouring in from the United States and Australia, media coverage and social media campaigns spreading the men's photographs across 2 countries. The FBI became involved. Mexican authorities mounted a major search of the rugged coast. On May 3rd, the searchers found them. In a remote, rugged hillside area near Ensenada, in a place called Santo Tomas, investigators discovered a well, a deep shaft roughly 50 feet down, located about 4 miles from where the men had been killed. At the bottom of the well were the decomposing bodies of the 3 surfers. The medical examiner confirmed that each had died from a gunshot wound to the head. There was an additional 4th body in the well as well, but investigators determined it had been there far longer and was not connected to the surfers, a separate victim of whatever else that lonely shaft had been used to hide. The families traveled to Baja to identify their sons. The discovery confirmed the worst. The crime caused enormous grief and anger in both home countries. In Australia, the killings of the 2 brothers were front-page news, and the Prime Minister spoke about the tragic loss. In the United States, the lacrosse world mourned Callum, with the professional league he had played in posting that it was heartbroken by the loss of the trio. The surfing community in Baja and across the border held a memorial paddle out, surfers gathering on the water at a beach in Ensenada to honor the 3 men and to call for justice and for safety, both for themselves and for the many travelers who came to that coast. Carter Rhodes' wedding, planned for that summer, would never happen. The investigation moved relatively quickly. Ari Giselle Silva Raya, the young woman who had spotted the campers and tipped off the killers, was arrested. So were the 3 men accused of carrying out the murders, identified by prosecutors as Jesus Gerardo Garcia Cota, known by the nickname El Quecas, his brother Irineo Francisco Garcia Montaño, and a 3rd man, Ángel Jesus León Aguilera. When Silva Raya was caught, she was found with one of the victim's cell phones in her possession. She told investigators that her boyfriend had come to her house and bragged about what he had done, telling her he had done something to 3 gringos. In November of 2025, more than a year after the killings, a judge in Ensenada sentenced her to 20 years in prison after she pleaded guilty to violent robbery and vehicle theft for her role in setting the crime in motion. The 3 men accused of the actual killings chose to go to trial and remained in custody, awaiting their proceedings. As the case developed, Mexican authorities indicated that the suspects had ties to the Sinaloa cartel faction that controlled the Ensenada area, and the men were transferred to a maximum security prison, a sign of how seriously the connection was taken. What made the case land so hard was the smallness of the motive against the size of the loss. There was no mistaken identity here, no confusing the surfers for rivals, no cartel war that swept them up by accident. 3 young men, 2 brothers and a soon-to-be-married friend, had driven down to camp and surf on a beautiful coast, and a young woman had looked at their truck and their phones and decided those things were worth more than their lives. The robbery was the whole point. The murders were what it cost to carry it out. Carter Rhodes, 30 years old and about to be married, died on a cliff above the Pacific for the tires on his truck and the phone in his pocket, and was thrown down a well in the dry hills of Baja, 4 miles from where he was killed. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case moves to the highlands of Michoacán, to a clandestine arena hidden on a ranch where men gathered late at night for an illegal cockfight. A young mother from the Chicago suburbs had come to Mexico to visit family and stopped in at the event with her teenage sister, and the 2 of them were standing in the crowd when the gunmen arrived. Section 6. Melissa Silva. Melissa Silva was 36 years old, a mother of 4 children. She had grown up in Warrenville, a quiet suburb west of Chicago. the kind of ordinary American town of subdivisions and schools and family life. As an adult, she had moved to Watsonville, in California, but her family ties reached back to Mexico, and like so many people with roots on both sides of the border, she traveled south to visit the relatives who still lived there. Those who knew her described her in the plainest and most human of terms, the description that recurs through so many of these stories because it is so often simply true. She was a hard-working mom. She was a woman raising 4 children, carrying the daily weight that mothers carry, with a life built around her family. She had come to Mexico to visit, the way she had surely done before, and she had brought along, or been joined by, her teenage sister, a 16-year-old girl named Arleth, who lived in the Chicago area. The 2 sisters were together that night, doing what visiting family does, spending time in the place their relatives called home. The event they attended was a cockfight, held at a clandestine venue in a place called Las Tinajas, in the municipality of Zinapecuaro, in Michoacán. Cockfighting has a long and complicated history in rural Mexico, woven into the culture of country life in ways that are hard to translate. A traditional entertainment that draws crowds to ranches and arenas across the region. This particular event was unlicensed, an underground gathering held inside a ranch that, by a cruel irony, was called El Paraíso, which means paradise. To the people who came that night, it was an ordinary social occasion, a place to gather and watch and pass a Sunday evening among neighbors and family. It was the kind of event a visitor might be brought along to, without a second thought, a window into the local life, a night out with relatives. Melissa and her sister were there as part of that. 2 women from the United States, spending an evening in the country their family came from, with no notion that the gathering had placed them in the path of a war. What the people in that arena could not have known was that the venue had become a target in the larger conflict tearing through Michoacán. The state was the battleground of a vicious struggle, with the Jalisco New Generation Cartel fighting against local criminal organizations, including a group tied to the region and a local gang, for control of the area and its drug routes. Clandestine gatherings like the cockfight, drawing crowds connected in various ways to the local community, could become flashpoints in that war. Places where rivals might be found, scores might be settled, or a massacre might be staged to send a message. On the night of Sunday, March 27, 2022, the cockfight at El Paraíso became exactly that. Gunmen arrived and opened fire on the crowd. The attack was a massacre in the fullest sense of the word, a sudden, overwhelming assault on a gathering of people, many of whom had nothing to do with whatever rivalry had brought the killers there. When it was over, 20 people were dead. It was, at the time, one of the worst mass shootings to take place in Mexico under the government then in power, a slaughter so large that it drew the attention of the president himself, who described it bluntly as a massacre of one group by another and blamed the criminal gangs operating in the area. Of the 20 killed, 17 were men and 3 were women. Melissa Silva was one of those 3 women. The young mother from Warrenville, who had come to Mexico to visit her family and stepped into a country cockfight with her teenage sister, was shot and killed in the crowd. Her sister Arleth, just 16 years old, was among the wounded. In the chaos of the shooting, the teenager was hit, shot twice in the leg and once in the lung. Her brother, Alex Silva, later described the agonizing way the family learned what had happened, the kind of fragmented, terrible account that comes in real time as a tragedy unfolds far away. He got a phone call from a friend, telling him they had heard gunshots and that the shots had come from that place. 2 minutes later, his mother called him. She had just arrived at the venue, and she had seen her oldest daughter, Melissa, lying on the floor. Arleth, the 16-year-old, appeared to have been trying to reach her older sister when she herself was hit. As Alex described it, it looked as though Arleth had been trying to walk toward Melissa, to go help her, and when she tried, she was struck by the gunfire. A younger sister trying to reach a dying older sister, both of them caught in a hail of bullets meant for someone else, in a country arena their family had brought them to for an ordinary night. The American government confirmed that United States citizens were among the dead. The Michoacán authorities, in the careful way that Mexican officials often identify victims, named 3 of the 20 as American citizens, releasing only their first names and the initials of their surnames. One of the 3 was the owner of the unlicensed cockfighting arena. Another was Melissa, identified in the official accounting only as Melissa S., before her family confirmed her full name to the press. That she was counted among the Americans killed underscored a reality that runs through so many of these cases. The people who die in Mexico's cartel violence are very often dual citizens, or American citizens with deep family ties to the country. People who exist in both nations at once, who are American by citizenship and Mexican by heritage, and who are drawn back across the border again and again by the bonds of family. Melissa Silva was an American mother of 4, a woman from the Chicago suburbs, and she died in a Michoacán cockfighting arena because she had gone to spend time with her family in the place they came from. In the aftermath, her family did the wrenching work that these deaths demand. Her brother Alex flew to Mexico to be with his wounded teenage sister and to bring her back home to Warrenville, to get the 16-year-old who had been shot in the leg and the lung out of the country and into safety. The decision was made to bury Melissa in Mexico. The family set up a fundraiser to help cover the funeral and the hospital expenses. The brutal practical costs that fall on families when violence strikes them across a border. The bills for treating a wounded child and burying a dead mother in a foreign country. A brother grieving a sister, tending to another wounded sister, navigating hospitals and funerals and the logistics of death in a place far from home, became the face of a family trying to absorb a blow that had come out of nowhere on an ordinary Sunday night. The massacre at Las Tinajas fit a pattern of mass violence that had become horrifyingly routine in Michoacán and across Mexico. In the same period, the country saw a wave of brazen mass killings, attacks on families and gatherings and public places carried out by criminal groups with apparent impunity. Earlier in the same month as the cockfight massacre, the mayor of a town in Michoacán had been shot dead. The violence was not confined to the cartel's own members, though officials often suggested that most victims of the drug war were connected in some way to organized crime. The reality on the ground was messier and crueler. Gatherings were attacked. Bystanders were killed. Families lost mothers and daughters and sons who had no part in any of it, who happened to be in the wrong place when the gunmen came. Melissa Silva was the clearest possible illustration of that truth. A hard-working mother of 4, with no connection to any cartel, killed in a massacre aimed at a war she had no part in. What makes Melissa's death particularly hard to absorb is the sheer ordinariness of how she came to be there. She had not sought out danger. She had not wandered into a remote and obviously perilous place. She had gone to a social gathering with her teenage sister while visiting family, the kind of evening that should have been unremarkable, a night out in the country. The venue was illegal, but the crowd was made up of ordinary people, families and neighbors and visitors, drawn by a traditional entertainment that has been part of rural Mexican life for generations. The danger was not visible. It arrived from outside, in the form of gunmen with a grievance against someone, and it did not distinguish between its intended targets and the mother from Warrenville standing in the crowd. The randomness of it, the way a Sunday night out could become a massacre, was the same randomness that ran through so many of these stories. The sense that in cartel country, no gathering was truly safe, that violence could descend on any crowd at any moment and take whoever happened to be standing there. Her family was left with the particular grief of a death that made no sense, that could not be explained by anything Melissa had done, that came down to the catastrophic bad luck of being in a certain arena on a certain night. A mother of 4 was gone, 4 children left without her, a teenage sister left wounded in body and haunted in memory by the sight of Melissa lying on the floor and the moment of being shot while trying to reach her. The family buried Melissa in Mexico, in the country that had drawn her south for a visit and had not let her leave. She was 36 years old, a hard-working mom, an American citizen, a daughter and a sister, and a mother, and she died in a massacre at a place called Paradise, in a state where the cartel's war could swallow any gathering whole. The case stands as one of the starkest examples in this account of how the violence of the Mexican drug war reaches beyond its intended targets to claim the lives of ordinary people, including Americans, who are simply present when it erupts. Melissa Silva was not a traveler on a dangerous highway, not a researcher on a remote back road, not anyone who could be mistaken for a rival. She was a woman at a social event, and the event was attacked, and she was among the 20 who did not survive. Her death is a reminder that in the parts of Mexico the cartels control, safety is not something that can be reliably secured by avoiding obvious risks, because the risk can arrive anywhere, at any gathering, carried by gunmen with grievances that have nothing to do with the people they kill. She had crossed the border to be with her family, and the war that had nothing to do with her ended her life in a crowd. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case returns to the desert highways of Sonora, where two elderly sisters from Arizona set out to drive to the town where they had both been born. They were on a road that travelers had been warned away from, carrying nothing but the ordinary belongings of a visit home, when armed men decided their vehicle was worth more than their lives. Section 7. Uvaldina and Enadina Curiel Mendoza. Uvaldina Curiel Mendoza was 82 years old, and her sister Enadina Curiel Mendoza was 72. They were Arizona residents who had both been born in the Sonoran city of Caborca, and in August of 2024, they set out to drive home to it along one of the most dangerous desert highways in northern Mexico. They were part of the large community of people who live their daily lives in the United States, while keeping their hearts and their histories tied to the towns they came from. One of the two was a United States citizen, and the other was a lawful permanent resident, a green card holder, the small distinction of legal status that meant nothing at all to the gunmen on the highway, and everything to the bureaucratic accounting that would follow their deaths. They lived in the Phoenix area, in homes in the United States, but they had homes and family in Mexico as well, and they crossed back and forth often, to see relatives and friends, or simply to spend time in the place that had made them. They were, in the plainest terms, the kind of travelers that the great web of cross-border family ties produces in enormous numbers, elderly women with deep roots on both sides of the line, making a journey they had surely made many times before, driving home to the town of their birth. There was nothing remarkable about the trip and nothing remotely suspicious about the two women making it. They were grandmothers. One of them was a mother of 4 and a grandmother to 6 grandchildren, described by her son as the glue of the immediate family, the person who held everyone together. They were the kind of women whose absence leaves a hole at the center of a family, the matriarchs, whose deaths scatter the people who had always gathered around them. And they were driving, as they had every right to do, to the place they were from. The road they would travel was the stretch of Federal Highway 2 that runs between the small border town of Sonoita and the city of Caborca, and it had become, by that summer, one of the most lethal pieces of pavement in the whole north of Mexico. It was the same triangle of desert that travelers heading to the beaches of Rocky Point were warned to avoid. The same ground that American government employees were forbidden from crossing, a region torn apart by warring factions of the Sinaloa cartel and other criminal groups fighting over the smuggling routes that run north toward Arizona. It was open desert, mile after mile of dry scrub and distant mountains, with long empty stretches where a vehicle was alone and far from any help. For most of its history, it had been simply the road home for the people of that part of Sonora, the route that connected the border to the towns of the interior. By 2024, it had become a place where the ordinary act of driving had turned into a gamble, where armed men set up their own roadblocks and watched the traffic, and where ordinary travelers, including Americans, had begun turning up dead. On the morning of Friday, August 23, 2024, the two sisters entered Mexico through the Lukeville-Sonoita port of entry. the same border crossing that travelers are advised to use, and began the drive south toward Caborca. They were traveling in a white Nissan Pathfinder with Arizona license plates. The road took them onto that contested federal highway, across the dangerous interior, toward the city where they had been born more than 7 and 8 decades earlier. Somewhere along that route, about 21 miles south of Sonoita, they came into the path of gunmen. What exactly the armed men wanted has been pieced together from the evidence and from the accounts of the family, and it points to a motive as old and as banal as it is cruel. They wanted the vehicle. Stealing cars and SUVs from travelers, both Mexican and foreign, had become a common practice in northern Sonora, with gunmen specifically targeting pickups and SUVs on those highways. An elderly pair of women in a Nissan Pathfinder, alone on an empty stretch of desert road, were an easy mark. The gunmen opened fire on the vehicle. Whether the sisters had failed to stop at one of the cartel's improvised checkpoints, or had driven into a firefight already underway, or had simply been fired upon by men who wanted their SUV and did not care who was inside it, the result was the same. The driver lost control of the Pathfinder when the shooting started. The vehicle was riddled with bullets, and it rolled over, coming to rest overturned on the side of the Sonoita-Caborca highway. Inside the bullet-ridden flipped SUV, the two sisters were dead. They were found at about 10:30 that morning, two elderly women in a wrecked and shot-up vehicle on a desert highway, killed on their way to the town where they had been born. Uvaldina was 82, and Adina was 72. They had set out to go home, and they had been murdered for the truck they were riding in. The husband of one of the women gave voice to the family's grief in the immediate aftermath, in a message posted to social media that captured the raw shock of it. He was a former professor at the University of Sonora who now lived in Phoenix, and he wrote that it was the most terrible day in the existence of his family, because gunmen wanting to rob his wife and his sister-in-law had killed them on that stretch of highway. The plainness of the words, the bewildered horror of a man trying to comprehend that his wife and her sister had been murdered for a vehicle, spoke to the senselessness at the heart of the case. There was no grand reason, no mistaken identity in a cartel war, no connection to anything criminal. Two old women had been killed because someone wanted their SUV. The grief spread outward through a family that straddled the border, the way the family itself did. There were children in Arizona and relatives in Caborca, the very town the sisters had been driving toward, people who had been expecting them, who had been waiting for the Pathfinder to pull up so the visit could begin. Instead, the news came the other way, traveling up from the highway to Phoenix and out to everyone who had known and loved the two women. A son lost his mother. A husband lost his wife. Nieces and nephews and grandchildren lost the women who had anchored the holidays, and the Sunday dinners, and the long phone calls. And all of it had happened in the space of a single morning, on a road that thousands of people with family in that part of Mexico drive every year without giving it a second thought, because for them, it is simply the way home. The Mexican authorities responded with the now familiar machinery of investigation, the same apparatus that swings into motion whenever a killing draws attention from across the border. Security forces from 3 levels of government, state, federal, and military, launched an operation to find the men responsible, using specialized air and ground units to search the desert. The search produced results, at least in the form of physical evidence. The authorities located a vehicle they believed had been used by the attackers, a stolen Ford pickup truck found abandoned in a town near the Arizona border. Inside it, the authorities found the equipment of cartel gunmen, 4 AK-47 assault rifles, dozens of cartridges and magazines of ammunition, and bulletproof vests, the unmistakable arsenal of organized crime. Investigators worked to establish whether the weapons matched the evidence recovered at the scene of the shooting, the casings and the bullets pulled from the wreckage of the Pathfinder. The Sonora governor confirmed that the attacker's vehicle and weapons had been seized, and said there were arrest warrants in the case. The FBI announced that it was assisting the Mexican authorities with the investigation into the murders of the 2 women, a sign that the killing of 2 Americans on a Mexican highway had registered at a serious level on the United States side as well. But despite the seized weapons and the announced warrants and the involvement of the FBI, no arrests were immediately reported, and the case settled into the same uncertain territory as so many others, an investigation that produced evidence and statements and promises, but no clear resolution that the family could hold on to. There was a stolen truck full of rifles, and there were warrants, and there was a desert that had swallowed the men who did it. For the relatives back in Arizona, the machinery of investigation, however much of it was set in motion, did not deliver the one thing they wanted, which was someone in a courtroom answering for what had been done to two grandmothers on their way home. The killing of the two sisters drew attention, in part, because it was so plainly an attack on the innocent, and in part, because it was not an isolated event, but a link in a chain. The son of one of the women pushed back hard against the easy framing of his mother's death as merely a case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, the phrase that gets applied to so many of these killings as though it explained anything at all. He insisted that the deeper truth was that the area was simply dangerous, that the drug cartels were running that part of Sonora, and that the violence was not some random misfortune, but a known and ongoing condition that the authorities had failed to control for years. He had spoken, he said, to people with first-hand experience of the violence in the area where his mother and aunt were killed, and the crime that had taken them was not recent or surprising. It had been going on for a long time. It was still going on. It was still killing innocent people, still killing grandmothers, and there was no answer to it, no end in sight, only a vicious cycle that devastated communities and the families left behind, one car at a time, one highway at a time. His point was borne out by the grim pattern around the case. The deaths of the two sisters in August of 2024 were part of a string of attacks on American travelers on the highways of northern Sonora. Only 2 months later, in October of the same year, on the same Federal Highway 2, in the same general region, a young Marine veteran from Tucson would be gunned down after failing to stop at an illicit checkpoint, in an attack that bore a chilling resemblance to the one that killed the sisters. The same roads, the same kind of victims, the same fatal logic, repeating itself within a single year. The killing of the Curiel Mendoza sisters was, in the grim accounting of the region, one of several incidents in which United States citizens or residents were fatally shot on those Sonora highways in a short span of time. Each one a separate family's catastrophe, all of them connected by the same underlying reality of cartel control over the roads. To the people who tracked such things, the highway between Sonoita and Caborca had become a kind of recurring crime scene, a place where the same story kept happening to different families, where the only variables were the names of the dead and the make of the vehicle the killers wanted. There was a particular cruelty in the kind of crime it was. This was not the death of someone caught in a battle between two armed groups, not a case of a bystander struck by a stray round in a firefight that had nothing to do with them. It was a robbery, a deliberate decision by armed men to take a vehicle from two elderly women and to kill them in the taking of it. The Pathfinder was the object of the whole exercise. The sisters were the obstacle. In the calculus of the men on that road, 2 human lives, 8 decades and 7 decades of living, of raising children and watching grandchildren grow, weighed less than a used SUV. That arithmetic, more than anything else about the case, was what the family could not absorb, because there was no version of it that made sense, no framework in which the trade was anything other than monstrous. The United States government's standing advice had long urged Americans to reconsider any travel to Sonora because of crime and kidnapping, warning that the state was a key location used by the international drug trade and human trafficking networks, that violent crime was widespread, and that travelers should maintain a heightened awareness everywhere they went in the state. American government employees were specifically forbidden from driving in the very triangle of desert where the sisters were killed. The warnings, as always, existed and were documented, and were difficult to weigh against the pull of home. 2 elderly women who had been born in Caborca were not going to be deterred from visiting their hometown by a paragraph in a travel advisory. They had crossed that border countless times across their long lives. They were going home, the way they always had, to the place that had made them, to the family that still lived there. The danger was abstract until the morning it was not, and by then it was a vehicle pulling alongside on an empty road and a burst of gunfire and a pathfinder rolling onto its roof in the desert. The advisories also illustrated the bind that families like theirs lived inside, a bind with no good way out. To heed the warnings fully would mean cutting themselves off from the place they came from the relatives who could not or would not move north, from the hometowns and the holidays and the rhythms of a life lived across a border. The travel warnings could tell people that a road was dangerous, but they could not replace what waited at the end of it. For a woman in her 80s who had been born in Caborca, the choice between an abstract risk and a concrete homecoming was not really a choice at all. She was going to see her family. She had always gone to see her family. The road had always been the road, and for most of her life, it had carried her there and back without incident, until the one time it did not. What makes the deaths of Uvaldina and Enadina Curiel Mendoza linger is the particular vulnerability of who they were. Two elderly sisters, grandmothers in their 70s and 80s, the matriarchs of a family, killed together on a single morning for the crime of driving a desirable vehicle on a dangerous road. There is something especially wrenching about the murder of the very old, people who had lived long, full lives, who had raised children and watched grandchildren grow, who were near the natural end of their time and should have been allowed to reach it in peace. They were not threats to anyone. They could not have resisted, could not have fought back, could not have done anything but sit in the vehicle as it came under fire. They were two women in a Pathfinder, and the gunman who wanted that Pathfinder shot them anyway, and left them dead in the overturned wreck on the side of the highway. The truck they had been killed for too damaged in the attack to even be driven away. The fact that they died together carried its own particular weight. They were sisters, born 10 years apart in the same Sonoran town, and they had stayed close enough across their long lives to be in the same vehicle on the same road, heading to the same home on the same morning. Whatever else can be said about the horror of it, they were not alone in their final moments. They were with each other, the way they had been with each other for more than 70 years. For the family, that was a thin and bitter comfort. But it was something, the knowledge that neither sister had to face the road, or the men on it, by herself. A son lost his mother and his aunt in the same instant. A husband lost his wife and his sister-in-law in the same instant. A family lost, in a single morning, the two women who had been its center, the grandmother of 6, who held everyone together, and the sister who had been at her side. The sisters were buried, the family was left to grieve, and the road that killed them remained exactly as dangerous as it had been the morning they drove onto it. There was no reckoning that could undo what had happened, no arrest reported that could return the two women to the family that had loved them, no change in the conditions on that highway that might keep the next pair of travelers safe. The seized rifles, and the abandoned truck, and the warrants, and the FBI's assistance all amounted, in the end, to the familiar shape of these cases, a great deal of motion and very little resolution, while the underlying machine that had killed the sisters, the cartel control of the roads, the targeting of vehicles, the impunity of the gunmen, kept running exactly as before. What remained was the shape of the thing itself, as stark as anything in this account. Two American grandmothers, born in a Sonora town, living out their later years in the suburbs of Phoenix, had set out one August morning to drive home and visit the place and the people they came from. They had crossed the border legally at the recommended port of entry and pointed their SUVs south toward the city of their birth. And on a desert highway, 21 miles into the trip, men who wanted their truck had shot them to death and rolled their vehicle into the scrub and left them there. They had survived 8 decades, and 7 had outlived so much, only to be killed by gunmen who valued a used SUV more than 2 human lives, on a road their own government had begged Americans never to drive, in a part of Mexico where the simple act of going home had become, for far too many families, the most dangerous thing a person could do. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case returns to the highways of Tamaulipas, the dangerous border state in Mexico's northeast, where an American family was driving home after a holiday visit with relatives. A vehicle cut across the road in front of them in the dark, and in the gunfire that followed, the youngest among them, a 13-year-old boy and a United States citizen, was killed. Section 8. Oscar Castillo Lopez. In the first days of January 2020, an American family from Oklahoma was driving home after spending the holidays with relatives in the central Mexican state of San Luis Potosí, headed north toward the border through the far northeastern corner of Tamaulipas, the borderland along the Rio Grande across from Texas. They were traveling in two vehicles, both bearing Oklahoma license plates. The parents were permanent residents of the United States. The children were American citizens. They had come south to see loved ones for the holidays, the way countless families with roots on both sides of the border do every Christmas and New Year. And now, with the new year just begun, they were making the long drive back toward home. Among them was a 13-year-old boy named Oscar Castillo Lopez. He was a United States citizen, an ordinary kid who, back home in Oklahoma, played outside with the other children in his neighborhood. A neighbor would later remember him as a boy who was always out playing basketball and running around with the kids down the street, the kind of child who was a familiar, friendly presence on the block, the sort of boy whose absence a whole neighborhood feels. He was riding in one of the family's two vehicles along with other relatives, including a 10-year-old boy, as the family made its way back toward the border and home. The corner of Tamaulipas they were passing through was, by that winter, one of the most dangerous stretches of ground on the entire continent. The state ran along the Rio Grande, the river that marks the line between Mexico and Texas, in a flat, dry country of two-lane highways and small towns strung out along the water. For most of its history, it had been ranch land and farmland, and people had crossed back and forth across the border the way they always had, to see family, to work, to live lives spread across both sides of a river that did not feel like much of a barrier. But by 2020, that stretch of borderland had become a no-man's land, carved up between criminal armies, where the highways themselves were battlegrounds, and the people who drove them at the wrong hour did so at the risk of their lives. The geography of the danger was specific and well known to anyone who studied it. The town of Ciudad Mier, sitting near the river, had for years marked the uppermost edge of one cartel's territory. Downriver, another town marked the limit of a rival organization. Between those 2 points lay a stretch of largely empty land, contested ground where neither group held full control and where heavily armed men patrolled in marked and unmarked vehicles, operating with near total impunity. The road that ran through that zone, a 2-lane highway running parallel to the border just across from the Texas side, cut straight through the worst of it. It was exactly the kind of road the United States government warned Americans never to use. Tamaulipas as a whole sat under the State Department's highest travel advisory, the Do Not Travel level, the same warning the government applied to active war zones, with explicit notice that criminal groups targeted cars and buses on the highways, that they took hostages for ransom, and that local law enforcement had little ability to do anything about it. What made roads like that one so lethal was the way the cartels treated movement through their territory. They did not simply tax or rob travelers. They watched the roads with lookouts, they ran their own checkpoints, and they reacted to any unfamiliar vehicle as a potential incursion by a rival group. A car full of strangers with out-of-state plates, moving after dark on a contested highway, could be read by armed men, not as a family, but as an enemy convoy, or as a target worth taking. And the difference between those readings and the truth meant nothing once the shooting started. The people most exposed to that danger were very often not hardened travelers, but ordinary families, people with relatives on the Mexican side who drove down for the holidays and drove back afterward, who knew the roads as the roads of their childhoods, and did not always carry in their heads the invisible, shifting map of which highway belonged to whom on any given night. On the night of Saturday, January 4th, 2020, the Oklahoma family was on that two-lane highway near Ciudad Mier, traveling after dark. Why they were on that particular stretch of road at night was a question that would be asked afterward, because it was among the worst possible places to be at the worst possible time. But families returning from holiday visits do not always know the precise and ever-changing geography of cartel territory, and the road was a route home, one more leg of a journey thousands of families make every year. One of the adults driving was a man named Jose Mendoza. He was at the wheel of a car, carrying his niece and her two sons, while other members of the family traveled in the second vehicle, the two cars moving together through the dark toward the border. As they drove, another vehicle began to chase them, then a second one. Armed men in two vehicles closed in on the family and signaled them to stop. The family, in their two cars, did not stop. Whether out of fear or instinct, or the simple terror of being ordered to pull over by armed strangers on a dark highway in the middle of nowhere, they refused to halt and kept moving, trying to outrun the vehicles bearing down on them. The attackers responded by ramming the family's cars. An SUV passed them and then cut sharply across the road in front of Jose Mendoza's vehicle, forcing a collision, blocking the road ahead so that the family could not get away. And then the gunmen opened fire. The man at the wheel later described those moments to reporters over the phone, in words that carried the raw helplessness of the situation. He said the gunmen blocked the road and started shooting, and that all he could do was pray. He said he prayed and prayed and prayed, that he did not want to die right then. He recounted, in the simplest terms, the horror of being trapped on a dark highway as bullets poured into the cars carrying his family, including the children riding in his own vehicle, with nowhere to go and nothing to do but lower his head and hope. A family member who survived described it just as plainly afterward, saying the bullets were everywhere. There was no cover on an open highway, no escape with the road blocked ahead and the gunmen alongside, only the thin metal of a car and the bodies inside it. When the shooting finally stopped, 13-year-old Oscar Castillo Lopez was dead. The boy who played basketball in his Oklahoma neighborhood, who ran around with the kids down the street, had been killed in the gunfire on that border highway, far from home, on the way back from a holiday visit. 3 other members of the family were wounded. Among the injured was the 10-year-old boy, also a United States citizen, struck in the same hail of gunfire that had killed Oscar, along with 2 adults. The gunmen, having done their work, escaped in another vehicle and vanished into the contested country between the 2 cartels' territories, the same emptiness they had come out of. All of the casualties had come from one of the family's 2 vehicles, the car that had borne the worst of the attack, while the other vehicle and the people in it came through. The survivors were rushed for medical treatment. The wounded were taken across the state line to hospitals in the neighboring state of Nuevo León, in the city of Cerralvo, and at the University Hospital in the city of Monterrey, where they were listed in stable condition in the days that followed. The family that had set out from San Luis Potosí to drive home to Oklahoma after a holiday visit was now scattered between a morgue and hospital beds, 1 child dead, and several of its members fighting to recover from gunshot wounds. The long drive home interrupted in the most violent way imaginable, hundreds of miles, still short of the border they had been trying to reach. The killing of a 13-year-old American boy on a Mexican highway drew immediate attention back in the United States. The FBI offered its assistance to the investigation. The Mexican embassy in Washington confirmed the death of the child and the wounding of his relatives. The State Department confirmed that an American citizen had been killed. And it happened against a backdrop that made it land even harder, because it came only about 2 months after the massacre of American families in the state of Sonora, in which 3 women and 6 children, all members of communities with deep roots in northern Mexico, were gunned down on a remote dirt road as they traveled. 2 American families, both with deep ties to Mexico, both simply traveling, both struck down by cartel gunfire within the span of a few weeks. The pattern was impossible to miss. Children had been killed in the fall, and now another child was dead in January. And in every case, the victims were Americans, caught in the violence of the roads, people who had crossed into Mexico for no reason more sinister than family, and had paid for it with their lives. The reaction reached the highest levels of the American government. The president responded to the attack publicly, saying the family had been killed after getting caught between two vicious drug cartels, and once again offering, as he had after the earlier massacre, to help Mexico fight the criminal organizations directly. The offer carried real political weight and met the same resistance it had met before, from a Mexican government that rejected the idea of foreign military intervention on its soil as an affront to its sovereignty. The two governments went back and forth, as they had so many times, over what could be done and who would do it, and whether anything could be done at all. But beneath the politics, the diplomacy, and the headlines, the reality was simpler and far smaller. A family in Oklahoma was grieving a boy. A mother and father were trying to understand how a holiday visit to see relatives had ended with their 13-year-old son dead on a highway and another child wounded. Mexican authorities did not release the names of the victims at first, and they did not state a clear motive. They did not formally identify which criminal group had carried out the attack, though the geography of the killing pointed inevitably at the war between the rival organizations that controlled and contested that stretch of border. A local Mexican newspaper attributed the attack to the criminal groups fighting over the area. The most likely explanation, the one that fit the place and the circumstances, was the same one that haunts so many of these cases. The family in their two vehicles, with out-of-state plates, moving through contested territory after dark, may have been mistaken for rivals, members of an opposing cartel intruding on the wrong ground, or simply targeted as unknown vehicles that did not belong. When the family refused the order to stop and tried to flee, the attackers forced them off the road and fired. A neighbor back in Oklahoma put it in the plainest words anyone could, saying the family had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. That phrase, the wrong place at the wrong time, was the entire tragedy compressed into a few words, and also, in its way, an evasion, because it made the deaths sound like an accident of weather, rather than the result of armed men choosing to fire on a car full of children. The family had done nothing wrong. They were not involved in the drug trade, not connected to any cartel, not carrying anything they should not have been carrying. They were an Oklahoma family who had gone to see relatives for the holidays and were driving home, the most ordinary errand in the world. The only thing that placed them in danger was the road itself, a highway through a war zone that they had to cross to get back toward the border and home. And on that road, on a January night, a 13-year-old boy who liked to play basketball with the kids on his street was killed because gunmen decided the family's vehicles were a threat, or a target, or simply something worth shooting at. There were no announced arrests in the case, no public resolution, no one held to account for Oscar's death. Like the overwhelming majority of crimes committed in that part of Mexico, it joined the vast number of cases that are never solved, the killings that produce grief and headlines and travel warnings but no justice, no trial, no name attached to the men who pulled the triggers. The investigation, whatever was made of it, faded the way so many do in a region where the authorities have little reach and the gunmen melt back into the territory they control. The family that survived carried their wounds home, along with the body of the youngest among them, and the people responsible were never publicly identified or punished. For Americans watching from across the border, the case sharpened a hard truth about the country next door, one that the earlier massacre had already begun to drive home. The danger was not confined to the people who lived in cartel country full-time, or to the adventurers and thrill-seekers who wandered into remote and obviously risky places. It could reach an ordinary family from Oklahoma on a holiday drive home. It could take the life of a 13-year-old child who had never done anything in his life more provocative than ride in the back seat of his family's car. The highways of Tamaulipas were not a place where innocence offered any protection at all, where being a child, or a family, or plainly uninvolved in anything, counted for nothing against the logic of the men who ruled the roads. The family had crossed into Mexico to spend the holidays with people they loved, and they brought home a coffin. The particular grief of the case settled on the smallest details, the way it always does. A boy who played basketball, a 10-year-old wounded in the same car, a driver who could do nothing but pray as the bullets came. A family that had gathered for the holidays, the most hopeful season of the year, and had been broken apart on the road back. There was a terrible ordinariness to all of it. The loaded vehicles, the relatives in San Luis Potosí, the long drive home, the kind of trip that millions of people make safely. And there was the single catastrophic difference. The stretch of road that should never have been driven after dark. The armed men who came out of the night and decided the family was something other than what it was. The line between an uneventful homecoming and a child's death came down to a highway and an hour, and the readings made by gunmen who would never have to answer for getting it wrong. What lingered, in the end, was the absence of any meaning that could be wrung from it. There was no cause Oscar had been pursuing, no risk he had knowingly taken, no decision of his own that had placed him in harm's way. He was 13 years old. He was a passenger. He had gone where his family went, the way any child does, and his family had gone to see the people they loved over the holidays, the way they always had. The drive home should have been the safe and forgettable part, the long, boring hours before the border and the familiar streets of Oklahoma. Instead, it was the part that killed him, on a road his own government had warned in the strongest possible terms that no American should ever drive, in a corner of Mexico that had become, for far too many families, a place from which a holiday visit could end in a funeral. His family was left to carry both the grief and the impossible questions that follow every one of these deaths, the questions that no arrest was ever going to answer, because no arrest ever came. How does a holiday visit to relatives end with a child shot dead on a highway? Why were they made to be the family that did not all come home? What could possibly have been worth the life of a 13-year-old boy to the men who fired into that car? There were no answers, only the body brought back across the border, the wounded recovering in hospital beds in Monterey, and then, eventually, at home, and a neighborhood in Oklahoma where a boy who used to play basketball in the street was suddenly and permanently gone. Oscar Castillo Lopez had crossed into Mexico as part of a family doing the most human thing imaginable, gathering for the holidays, and he became one more American child killed on a Mexican road for being in the path of a war that had nothing to do with him. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case moves to a highway in the state of San Luis Potosí, the same state the Oklahoma family had been visiting, but a decade earlier. Two American agents, traveling in an armored SUV with diplomatic plates, were run off the road by a cartel hit squad. One of them was dragged toward the door of the vehicle, and what happened to him on that highway would set off one of the largest cross-border manhunts in the history of the two countries. Section 9. Haime Zapata. Haime Jorge Zapata was born on May 7, 1978, in Brownsville, Texas, the border city that sits directly across the river from Matamoros. He came from a family steeped in service. His father, Amador, had spent his life in law enforcement, and Jaime followed him into it, as did his brothers. He was one of 5 brothers, and all 5 of them went into the field of criminal justice. He attended Homer Hanna High School in Brownsville, and then graduated from the University of Texas at Brownsville in 2005 with a degree in criminal justice. He had grown up on the border, in a place where, as people in those towns sometimes say, a young person has 2 roads in front of them, to become a cop or to become a criminal. Jaime chose the first, and he never looked back. He was, by every account of the people who knew him, a man who was born to the work. His path through American law enforcement was steady and serious. In February of 2006, he became an agent with the United States Border Patrol, graduating from the academy and being assigned to a station in Yuma, Arizona. Later that same year, he joined Immigration and Customs Enforcement, the agency known as ICE, and was assigned to work out of Laredo, Texas, where he spent his last 5 years investigating drug trafficking, gun running, and money laundering on one of the busiest stretches of the border. By 2011, he was a special agent with Homeland Security Investigations, the investigative arm of ICE, a federal officer doing the work of disrupting the criminal networks that moved people and drugs and weapons across the line. He was 32 years old, engaged to be married to a woman named Stacy, and remembered around the Laredo office for his wide grin, his practical jokes, his love of fishing and barbecuing, and a kindness that the people who worked beside him never forgot. The ICE director would later say of him that he did not have a selfish bone in his body, that he was always more concerned with helping others than himself, and that he never did a mean turn to anyone. His own partner, the man who would be shot beside him, summed him up in the simplest words, calling him just genuinely a good guy. Earlier in 2011, he had been detailed to Mexico, assigned to work out of the United States Embassy in Mexico City. It was supposed to be a relatively safe posting. He had told his parents about it, reassuring them. He explained that he would be working out of the embassy and traveling in an armored vehicle. To a family that knew the dangers of the country, those details were meant to be comforting. He would be protected. He would be careful. He would come home. On February 15, 2011, Haime Zapata and another Homeland Security Investigations special agent, a man named Victor Avila, set out on the road. At dawn that morning, they had left Avila's apartment in Mexico City and begun winding north out of the sprawling capital, heading up toward San Luis Potosí. They were on an assignment for ICE, 2 American agents moving through the heart of Mexico. Avila was the near opposite of Zapata in temperament, a serious, veteran agent with a wife and 2 children. But the 2 men had much in common. Both were Mexican-American, both bilingual, both raised in Texas border towns, both drawn into the same line of work. They were traveling in an armored Chevrolet Suburban, a heavy reinforced vehicle, and it carried diplomatic license plates that marked it as belonging to United States officials. The day was perfectly clear. They could see for miles across the foothills of the Sierra Madre. Zapata was behind the wheel. As they drove north on Highway 57, the agents noticed 2 SUVs coming up behind them, moving fast and driving aggressively. The vehicles closed in. One of them passed the agent's Suburban, while gunmen began firing on the armored vehicle. The attackers worked to force the agents off the road and eventually rammed them, running the Suburban off the highway and cutting it off so it could not move. According to later accounts, the ambush had the character of a fake checkpoint. The gunmen in camouflage, armed with machine guns, a force of as many as 15 men descending on the 2 agents. They were trapped, run off the road, surrounded by an armed force in a place where no help was anywhere close. Investigators would later recover roughly 90 spent shell casings from the scene, a measure of how much firepower the gunmen poured into that single vehicle. What happened next was an act of desperate composure under impossible conditions. The agents were inside an armored vehicle, which gave them some protection, but the situation was collapsing fast. One of them rolled down the window, or cracked it, to try to communicate, to make the attackers understand who they were dealing with. They identified themselves as United States diplomats, hoping that the knowledge that they were American officials might make the gunmen realize they were making a catastrophic mistake and pull back. It did not work. There was a terrible moment of mechanical bad luck in the middle of it. When Haime Zapata shifted the vehicle into park, its doors automatically unlocked. The Zeta gunmen seized the chance, pulled open the driver's side door, and tried to drag Zapata out of the Suburban. He fought them. In the middle of an ambush, encircled by armed men, with a rifle pointed at him at point-blank range, he struggled against them and managed to pull the door back and relock the vehicle, keeping himself and his partner from being hauled out into the open, where they would have had no chance at all. But the gunmen kept firing. By the surviving agent's account, even after the agents had told the attackers they were American diplomats, the response was not retreat. One account of the exchange held that the gunmen made clear they did not care who the agents were and opened fire regardless. The diplomatic plates on the vehicle had already signaled that United States officials were aboard, and the agents had said so out loud, and the Zetas shot them anyway. They poured gunfire into the Suburban. Then, having done what they came to do, the gunmen fled the scene. Both agents had been hit. Victor Avila had been shot 3 times, once in the chest and twice in the left leg. He was alive, and he managed to use his cell phone to call for help. Haime Zapata had been hit several times and was gravely wounded. In a final act of will, dying at the wheel, Zapata managed to put the vehicle in gear and drive it away from the ambush site before he collapsed. Then there was the waiting. For roughly 40 minutes, Avila sat along the highway, his ears ringing, his wounded legs swelling. The young agent he had only recently come to know slumped over beside him in the seat. Haime Zapata was dead. Soon afterward, a Mexican federal police helicopter reached the 2 agents, and Avila was eventually evacuated and taken to a hospital in Houston, where he survived. But Zapata, with multiple bullet wounds, died before the authorities could get him the medical treatment that might have saved him. He died on that highway in San Luis Potosi, an American agent, killed on a Mexican road by the gunmen of Los Zetas, a long, long way from the border town where he was born. The notification reached his family the way such news always does, suddenly and brutally. In Laredo, the ICE agents were gathered into a conference room and told there had been an ambush in central Mexico, and that one of their own, Haime Zapata, had been involved. The room went silent, and the agents clasped hands and prayed. In Brownsville, in the small white house where Jaime's parents lived, government SUVs began lining up in the driveway. His mother, Mary, was in her bedroom when her husband came in. She phoned relatives to ask for prayers, still hoping, and when she got off the phone, one of her sons told her plainly that Haime was dead. The killing sent a shock through both governments. It was the second high-profile murder of an American agent in Mexico in the history of the drug war, the first having been the torture and murder of a DEA agent named Kiki Camarena by the Guadalajara cartel decades earlier. For an American federal officer to be ambushed and killed on a major highway in an armored vehicle with diplomatic plates after identifying himself as a diplomat was an extraordinary escalation. The President of the United States personally called Zapata's parents to offer his condolences. The Secretary of Homeland Security declared that any act of violence against ICE personnel was an attack on all those who served the nation and put their lives at risk for its safety. The Mexican president pledged cooperation and said the death should push the 2 countries to work together for a more peaceful future in the region. There was confusion and controversy at first over exactly why the agents had been attacked. Some of the men later captured claimed in their interviews that they had mistaken the agents for members of a rival drug cartel, the same mistaken identity explanation that recurs again and again in these cases. But the surviving agent's account cut against that. By his telling, the gunmen had been told the men in the vehicle were American diplomats and had fired anyway, suggesting they either knew or did not care that they were attacking United States law enforcement. The diplomatic plates and the agent's own words had made it plain. A Texas congressman who followed the case stated that the gunmen had opened fire after the agents identified themselves. Whatever the gunmen believed in the chaos of the ambush, the outcome was an American officer dead on a Mexican highway, and many in both countries came to regard the attack as a planned and premeditated assault on unarmed agents. The killing of Haime Zapata also opened a painful and explosive controversy back in the United States, one that had nothing to do with Mexico's gunmen and everything to do with how the weapon that killed him had reached their hands. Investigators traced one of the firearms used in the attack, the rifle that killed Zapata and wounded Avila, back across the border to Texas. It was a semi-automatic rifle, and it had been purchased by a man in the Dallas area, its serial number filed off, then smuggled into Mexico along with other rifles. The buyer was what is known as a straw purchaser, someone who buys guns legally on behalf of people who cannot. and it emerged that this buyer and the traffickers he worked with had been on the radar of American firearms authorities months before the gun that killed Zapata was ever bought. The traffickers had been traced to a cache of illegal firearms being smuggled to Mexico, and yet, according to the account that infuriated the family and congressional investigators, no move was made to question or charge them at the time. They went on to traffic dozens more weapons, including the one used against Zapata, before finally being arrested after his death. The revelation drew the case into the bitter scandal surrounding a federal operation that had allowed guns to flow into Mexico in the hope of tracing them to cartel leaders, an operation that had lost control of many of those weapons. The idea that the gun used to murder an American agent might have crossed the border under the watch of his own government's agencies turned Zapata's death into a symbol of a far larger failure. His mother became one of the most determined voices in the search for the truth. She said she prayed the weapon that killed her son had not come from the United States and been allowed to travel to Mexico, and she feared a cover-up. She and her husband filed formal requests for the government's records of the case, directed at the very agencies whose leaders had stood up to eulogize Haime at his funeral. One after another, the requests were denied. She described a dream she said she had a few days after his death, in which Haime came to her, pointed to his lips, and told her that he could not speak, that she had to speak for him, that she had to seek justice and make sure no one else had to go through what he had gone through. She carried that charge forward for years. The investigation into the murder itself, however, was relentless, and it produced something rare in these stories, which is a real measure of accountability. Because the victim was an American federal agent, the United States worked closely with Mexican authorities on the Mexican-led investigation, and the pressure to find the killers was enormous. Over time, the people responsible were captured. Among those taken into custody was Jesus Enrique Rejon Aguilar, one of the most powerful leaders of Los Zetas, described as among the most senior figures in the entire organization and the boss of the territory where Zapata was killed. Several of the gunmen and accomplices were eventually extradited to the United States, tried in American courtrooms, convicted of the murder of a federal officer, and sentenced to life in prison. The man who had purchased the murder weapon pleaded guilty in Texas. The killing of Haime Zapata did not vanish into the vast pile of unsolved cases the way so many cartel murders do. The full weight of two governments came down on it. Brownsville, the border city where he was born and raised, never let his memory fade. His body came home in a coffin draped with an American flag, met at the airport by a long motorcade. On the morning of February 22, 2011, more than 1,000 mourners crowded into the city's event center for his funeral mass. The Attorney General of the United States, the Secretary of Homeland Security, and the Director of ICE all delivered eulogies, calling him a hero in every sense of the word, and vowing that the men who had taken his life would be brought to justice. In one of the most quietly devastating moments of the service, his partner Victor Avila, his wounds hidden beneath a dark suit, was rolled in a wheelchair to the side of Zapata's coffin, where he laid down a single flower. The city later renamed a road in Zapata's honor, and a piece of federal legislation dealing with border security task forces was named after him as well. He was posthumously awarded ICE's highest honor for valor. The University of Texas at Brownsville named him a distinguished alumnus. A training facility was named for him, and an annual fishing tournament, fitting for a man who loved to fish, was held in his memory in his hometown. He was laid to rest at a memorial garden in Brownsville, in the city where he was born. His case stands a little apart from the others in this account, because Haime Zapata was not a tourist, or a traveler, or a family on a holiday drive. He was a federal agent, doing dangerous work in a dangerous place, and he understood the risks of the country he was operating in. But he was also, at the most basic level, an American killed by a Mexican cartel, gunned down on a highway by men who ran him off the road, surrounded his vehicle, and opened fire even after being told who he was. He had fought them off long enough to keep himself and his partner from being dragged out into the open, and he had driven the vehicle away from the kill zone with bullets in him before he died. He was 32 years old, engaged to be married, the son of a lawman and the brother of 4 more. He had spent his short life protecting the border he was born on, and he died on the wrong side of it, in a state where the highways belonged to the Zetas and a set of diplomatic plates meant nothing at all. His mother had promised to speak for him, and for years afterward she did. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The final case is the one that began it all, the killing that taught both countries what the cartels were capable of doing to an American. Decades before any of the others, in the city of Guadalajara, an undercover agent was taken off the street in broad daylight, held in a private house, and tortured over many days by men who wanted to know everything he knew. His death changed the war between the United States and the cartels forever. Section 10. Enrique Camarena. Enrique Camarena Salazar, known to everyone as Kiki, was born on July 26, 1947, in the border city of Mexicali, just south of California. When he was a child, his family moved across the line to Calexico, California, 3 brothers and 3 sisters together, and they endured real poverty after the move. His parents had divorced when he was young, and the family struggled. His oldest brother died of malaria while serving with the United States Army in Vietnam. But Kiki worked his way through it. He graduated from Calexico High School in 1966, and after high school he joined the Marines, serving until 1970. When he was discharged, he came home to Calexico and joined the police department, and from there he moved into undercover narcotics work, the field that would define his life. When the Drug Enforcement Administration was created in 1973 and began hiring Spanish-speaking agents, Kiki Camarena joined, becoming a special agent in the DEA's office in his hometown. He was, by every account, exceptional at the work. He had grown up between 2 cultures and 2 languages, and he could move between them effortlessly, slipping into different accents and different roles, blending into the street in a way few agents could. Colleagues described him as driven even by the standards of an agency full of obsessive people. He had a particular gift that mattered more than any other in the work he did, which was a talent for cultivating informants, for convincing frightened people to take terrible risks and tell him what they knew. One writer who chronicled his career said nobody else in his office could match his ability to convince a man to summon up his courage and venture where he never dreamed he would go. In 1980, a close friend who had transferred to the DEA office in Guadalajara suggested Kiki apply for an opening there. Foreign postings were valuable for advancement, and the Guadalajara office was getting busy, a sign of the explosion in trafficking that was about to come. By then, Kiki was married to his wife Mika and had 3 young sons. The family weighed it and decided the move would be good for them, drawn by the pleasant climate, the American school, the favorable exchange rate. So Kiki Camarena took up his post in Guadalajara, and over the next 4.5 years he became one of the most effective American drug agents in Mexico, at the exact moment the country was becoming the great corridor for narcotics heading into the United States. He arrived just as a new generation of traffickers was rising. The men who would come to be known as the Guadalajara cartel, among them Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, and Rafael Caro Quintero, were coordinating their production and operations and building an empire on marijuana and increasingly on cocaine moving north. They operated through corruption and intimidation, with officials and police on their payroll throughout the system. And the work the DEA agents could do against them was sharply limited. Agents in Mexico had no law enforcement powers of their own. They could gather intelligence, advise, and cultivate informants, but they could not make arrests, and they operated under the constant threat of being detained themselves. Kiki and the others were essentially intelligence officers in hostile territory, surrounded by a state riddled with people working for the very men they were trying to bring down. Camarena threw himself at the work anyway, and his informants led him to extraordinary discoveries. His work helped uncover, in 1982, one of a new kind of massive marijuana plantation, a farm of more than 200 acres employing hundreds of growers in a remote stretch of the country, the largest discovered up to that time. But the blow that sealed his fate came in 1984. Acting on information the DEA had developed, hundreds of Mexican soldiers, backed by helicopters, descended on an enormous marijuana plantation in the state of Chihuahua, a complex known as Rancho Buffalo that sprawled across thousands of acres and was estimated to produce billions of dollars worth of product every year. It was a catastrophic financial loss for the traffickers, one of the largest such raids ever carried out, and the traffickers believed they knew who was responsible. Suspicion fell on Kiki Camarena as the source of the intelligence that had cost them so much. In the world of the Guadalajara cartel, that kind of loss demanded an answer, and the men who ran it decided to make an example of the American agent who had humiliated them. On February 7, 1985, in broad daylight, Kiki Camarena left the United States consulate in Guadalajara to meet his wife for lunch. As he walked, he was seized off the street. The men who took him were not random street criminals. They were corrupt Mexican officials, police officers working for the major traffickers, and they bundled him into a car and drove him away in the middle of the day. Later that same day, a Mexican pilot named Alfredo Zavala Avelar, who had flown missions with Camarena and worked as a DEA asset, was also abducted. Two men who had worked against the cartel were now in the cartel's hands. Camarena was taken to a private house on a street called Lope de Vega, in a comfortable residential neighborhood in the western part of Guadalajara, a property connected to Rafael Caro Quintero. There, in that house, he was tortured. The men who held him wanted to know everything he knew, everything the DEA had on them, the names of his informants, the extent to which they had been penetrated. They worked on him over a period of roughly 30 hours. The brutality was extreme and deliberate. To keep him alive and conscious, so the torture could continue and they could keep extracting information, a physician was brought in to revive him and prolong his suffering. By the time they were done, his body had been broken in ways that are difficult to describe, and that this account will not dwell on beyond what is necessary to understand the cruelty of it. His skull had been pierced, his ribs had been broken, and in the end they killed him. The DEA agent, who had been one of the best in Mexico, died in a cartel safe house, tortured to death by men determined to send a message. For nearly a month, his fate was unknown. His abduction set off alarm at the highest levels of the United States government. Then, on March 5, 1985, the bodies of Camarena and the pilot Alfredo Zavala Avelar were found wrapped in plastic, dumped in a rural area outside a small town in the neighboring state of Michoacán. Kiki Camarena was 37 years old. He left behind his wife Mika and their 3 sons, who were 11, 6, and 4 years old. His body was eventually cremated, and his ashes were spread over a mountain near Calexico, the California border town where he had grown up. The torture and murder of an American DEA agent in Mexico produced a reaction unlike anything that had come before. The DEA launched what became the largest homicide investigation in the agency's history, an operation given a code name meaning legend. A special unit was dispatched to coordinate the hunt for the killers inside Mexico, and what that investigation uncovered was damning not only to the cartel, but to the Mexican state itself. Government officials were implicated, including past directors of the Mexican Federal Police and of Mexico's branch of Interpol. Investigators concluded that Mexican police had actively worked to cover up the crime, even destroying evidence on Camarena's body. The killing had not been the work of the cartel alone. It had been carried out by men wearing the uniforms of the Mexican government, working for the traffickers, in a system where the line between the two had dissolved. The pursuit of justice that followed was long, dogged, and at times legally explosive. Under intense pressure from Washington, Mexico apprehended 2 of the cartel leaders, Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo and Rafael Caro Quintero, relatively quickly, though the third, Felix Gallardo, enjoyed political protection and was not arrested until 4 years later. The United States pursued the case across borders for years, leading to a series of trials in Los Angeles of Mexican nationals connected to the crime. The hunt was so determined that in at least one instance, the DEA arranged for a suspect, the physician accused of keeping Camarena alive so the torture could continue, to be seized in Mexico by bounty hunters and brought across the border to face trial, a move that enraged the Mexican government and eventually reached the United States Supreme Court. Several defendants were convicted of participating in the kidnapping. Mexican officials with ties to corruption were among those implicated and tried. The case never fully closed, and it never stopped troubling relations between the two countries. The convicted trafficker Rafael Caro Quintero was released from a Mexican prison in 2013 on a legal technicality, an event that outraged the United States, before being recaptured by Mexican forces years later. Over the decades, a number of former DEA agents, former intelligence officers, journalists, and historians have argued that the story of Camarena's death was more complicated than the official account, raising allegations about deeper involvement by other actors and contending that Camarena had uncovered things that powerful people wanted buried. Those allegations have been disputed and denied, and the full truth of what Kiki Camarena knew and why exactly he died has been argued over ever since. The United States Department of Justice reopened an investigation into the murder decades after the fact. What is not in dispute is the core of it, the part that mattered most to the people who loved him and to the agents who served alongside him. An American DEA agent had been taken off the street in broad daylight, tortured for 30 hours in a cartel safe house with the complicity of corrupt officials, and murdered, his broken body dumped in a field. The killing transformed everything. It marked the moment the United States understood, in the most personal and brutal terms, the scale of what it was facing in Mexico, and the degree to which the cartels had bought and corrupted the institutions that were supposed to fight them. It was the first great escalation, the killing that the murder of the ICE agent Haime Zapata, a quarter-century later, would be measured against as only the second high-profile killing of an American agent on Mexican soil. The phrase that defined the cartel's way of doing business, silver or lead, the bribe or the bullet, became the title of a book one of Camarena's own DEA colleagues wrote about the case, because Camarena's death was the purest expression of what happened to those who could not be bought. But Kiki Camarena's legacy was not only the war that followed. It was also something gentler and more enduring, carried forward by the people who refused to let him be only a symbol of violence. In the wake of his murder, his community in California began wearing red ribbons in his memory, a small gesture of mourning and of defiance against the drug trade that had killed him. That gesture grew into Red Ribbon Week, a nationwide program that every year teaches school children across the United States to stay away from drugs, all of it founded in the memory of a single agent murdered in Guadalajara. Schools, a library, and a street in his hometown of Calexico bear his name. A foundation established in his memory, with his widow Mica and his son serving on its board, carries on the work of drug and violence prevention. He received, after his death, the highest honor his agency could give. Decades after he died, children who have never heard his name still wear red ribbons every October because of what was done to him. Kiki Camarena had grown up poor on the border, served his country as a Marine, become a police officer, and then spent his life as one of the most gifted drug agents the United States ever sent into Mexico. He had a wife and 3 young sons, and a gift for getting frightened people to be brave. He was an American who went south to do dangerous work in a dangerous place, and the men he was fighting took him off a street in daylight and tortured him to death over 30 hours to find out what he knew and to warn anyone who might follow him. His murder was the beginning of the modern war, the killing that drew the line, the first time the cartels showed both nations exactly how far they would go against an American who got in their way. Everyone who died in the decades after him, the travelers and the families and the agents, came after Kiki Camarena in a story whose darkest chapter he was the first to write. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.